The lecture hall aboard the research station Convergence buzzed with quiet conversation as students from across the galaxy took their seats. Professor stood at the front of the room, her tall, thin frame casting strange shadows under the artificial lights. Her skin had a blue-green color that shifted slightly when she moved, and her four eyes could look in different directions at the same time. She was one of the most respected scientists among the people, and her research on species survival was known throughout the academic world. Sarah sat in the third row, checking her notes from the previous lecture. Next to her, stretched his arms and yawned, still tired from his late-night study session. David sat on Sarah's other side, quietly observing their classmates as they filed into the room. The three humans were part of an exchange program that brought together graduate students from many different worlds. Around them sat their alien classmates. The students looked like walking crystals, their bodies made of clear, hard material that caught and reflected the room's lights. They moved slowly and deliberately, each step creating a soft chiming sound. They floated slightly above their seats, their gas-based bodies contained in special suits that let them interact with solid objects. Their forms swirled and changed color as they breathed and communicated with each other. In the back rows, the hive mind students clustered together. Each one looked like a large insect, but their individual minds were connected to a shared consciousness. They rarely spoke aloud, preferring to communicate through rapid movements of their antennae and changes in the patterns on their shells. Professor activated the holographic display system, and images filled the air above the students. The first image showed a frozen planet covered in ice and snow, with winds so strong they created visible white storms across the surface. Today we will examine survival adaptation across hostile environments, Professor said, her voice carrying a slight accent that made some words sound longer than others. My recent research has focused on how different species respond to extreme cold environments, particularly Class VII ice planets. The hologram changed to show a chart filled with numbers and graphs. Different species were listed along one side, with survival times listed next to each name. Sarah squinted at the display, trying to read the small text. As you can see from this data, the professor continued, survival times vary greatly between species. Though with their crystalline structure, can survive for up to 48 hours on ice planets by entering a dormant state that requires minimal energy. They can regulate their internal temperature for approximately 36 hours before their gas composition becomes unstable. Raised his hand. What about humans, Professor? Professor's expression changed slightly, and Sarah thought she saw something that looked almost like amusement in the alien's multiple eyes. Humans, the professor said, pausing to look directly at the three human students, present a particularly interesting case study. Your species lacks the natural adaptations that other species have developed over millions of years of evolution. You have no natural insulation beyond a thin layer of skin and hair. You cannot regulate your internal temperature like nor can you enter protective dormant states like the hologram showed a human figure next to the survival chart. The number next to it was much smaller than the others, 15 to 20 minutes without technological assistance. Your survival time on a Class VII ice planet would be measured in minutes, not hours, Professor continued. This is not a criticism of your species, merely an observation based on biological facts. Humans have instead developed what some call primitive tool usage, but this requires prepared materials and significant time to implement. David shifted in his seat and exchanged a look with Sarah, and the three had grown up in different parts of Earth, but they all had memories of winter camping trips, ice fishing, and cold weather activities that their families had taught them. Now, some might argue that human tool-making abilities could compensate for these physical limitations, Professor said, activating a new display that showed various human tools and shelters. However, these techniques require prepared materials, extensive planning, and considerable time to implement. In a true survival scenario, where one must work with only materials found in the environment, these advantages become largely irrelevant. A student's body chimed softly, and Professor nodded in their direction. Yes, Han. This voice sounded like wind blowing through crystal formations. Professor, are there documented cases of human survival in extreme cold without prepared technology? Some anecdotal reports exist, Professor replied, but they typically involve humans who had extensive preparation time or access to materials that had been gathered in advance. In a spontaneous survival situation, human limitations become apparent very quickly. Sarah felt her jaw clench slightly. She remembered her grandmother telling her stories about their ancestors who had lived in Alaska, building shelters from nothing but snow and ice when they got caught in unexpected storms. This brings us to this semester's final practical examination, Professor announced, and the room became completely quiet. You will be transported to the ice moon aura, where you must survive for 6 hours using only materials you can find on the surface. Each species group will be evaluated based on their natural survival capabilities. The hologram now showed the ice moon, a barren landscape of white and gray under a dim sun. Wind patterns were visible as streaming lines across the surface, and temperature readings showed numbers that made involuntarily shiver. I have prepared emergency shelters and heating units that will be available if any student group finds themselves unable to cope with the conditions, Professor said, looking directly at the human students again. These will prevent any loss of life, though using them will result in failing the examination. The students swirled with what their species considered excitement, their forms taking on brighter colors. The hive mind's antennae moved rapidly as they processed and shared information about the coming test. Are there any questions about the examination parameters? Professor asked. David raised his hand. Will we have access to any tools at all? Only what you carry with you normally, the professor replied. Standard clothing, personal items, nothing specialized for survival purposes. Sarah touched the small multi-tool she always kept on her belt, thinking about the dozens of ways her grandfather had taught her to use simple objects for survival. Quietly felt the metal belt buckle he wore, remembering how his father had shown him to use similar objects for cutting and shaping materials. The examination will take place in 3 days, Professor concluded. I suggest you spend this time preparing mentally for the challenges ahead. Class dismissed. As the students filed out of the lecture hall, the 3 humans walked together in thoughtful silence. Around them, their alien classmates discussed the coming test with confidence, each species certain that their natural adaptations would carry them through the examination successfully. None of them noticed the small smile that passed between the human students, or the way they began quietly discussing snow conditions and wind patterns as they headed back to their dormitory. 3 days later, the research shuttle Academic Explorer descended through the thin atmosphere of Aura. Through the small windows, the students could see an endless landscape of white ice and gray rock stretching to the horizon. The wind outside was strong enough to rock the shuttle slightly as they approached the landing site. Professor stood at the front of the passenger compartment, holding onto a support rail as the shuttle bumped through the turbulent air. Her 4 eyes moved independently, checking readings on her handheld device while also watching her students' reactions. Current surface temperature is negative 47 degrees Celsius, she announced over the sound of the engines. Wind speed is averaging 60 kilometers per hour, with gusts up to 80. The examination period will begin the moment we land and will continue for exactly 6 hours. Sarah looked out the window at the bleak landscape below. The ice stretched away in all directions, broken only by occasional rocky outcroppings and strange formations where the wind had carved the frozen surface into unusual shapes. She could see patterns in the snow that told her about wind direction and the way storms moved across the surface. checked his watch, and then looked at his two human companions. They had spent the last 3 days quietly preparing, sharing knowledge that their families had passed down through generations. Each of them came from different cold climate backgrounds on Earth, and together they represented centuries of accumulated survival wisdom. David studied the landing site through his window. He could see where the wind hit the rocky formations and how it created protected areas behind them. His grandmother had taught him to read landscape like this when they went camping in the mountains of Korea. The students sat completely still, their crystalline bodies already beginning to change in response to the cold they could feel through the shuttle's hull. Their transparent forms were taking on a denser, more solid appearance as they prepared their natural dormancy response. The students floated quietly in their environmental suits, their gas-based forms swirling more slowly as they began to conserve energy. Their colors had shifted to deeper, warmer hues that would help them retain heat in the coming hours. In the back of the shuttle, the hive mind students clustered together even more closely than usual. Their antennae touched and moved rapidly as they shared information and coordinated their group's survival strategy. As a connected consciousness, they could distribute their energy and awareness among multiple bodies. The shuttle landed with a soft thump, and immediately the sound of wind became much louder. Professor activated her recording equipment and checked the readings from the external sensors. "Remember," she called out as the students prepared to exit, "you have 6 hours to demonstrate your species' survival capabilities. Emergency shelters are available if needed, but using them means automatic failure of the examination." The shuttle door opened, and immediately the brutal cold hit everyone like a physical blow. The alien students moved quickly to implement their survival strategies, while the humans stepped out more slowly, taking time to observe and assess their environment. The students found a flat area about 50 meters from the landing site and arranged themselves in a perfect hexagonal pattern. Their bodies began to crystallize further, becoming more opaque and solid. Within minutes, they had entered a state that looked almost like suspended animation, their life functions slowed to conserve energy. They gathered near a rocky outcropping that provided some protection from the wind. They connected their environmental suits together, creating a shared atmosphere that would help them regulate their temperature collectively. Their forms became less active, moving in slow, synchronized patterns that required minimal energy. The hive mind students worked together to dig a shallow depression in the snow behind the largest rock formation they could find. They arranged themselves in a tight cluster, their bodies creating a natural insulation system. Their shared consciousness meant they could coordinate their efforts perfectly to maintain group warmth. Professor watched all of this from inside the heated command module she had set up near the shuttle. Her instruments tracked each student group's vital signs and environmental conditions. Everything was proceeding exactly as her research had predicted. Then she turned her attention to the human students, expecting to see them huddled together and already showing signs of distress. Instead, she saw something that confused her scientific understanding. The 3 humans were spread out across the landing area, but they were not panicking or seeking immediate shelter. Sarah walked in a wide circle around the site, stopping every few steps to examine the snow and ice. She knelt down and picked up handfuls of snow, testing its consistency and moisture content. Was examining the rocky outcroppings, running his hands along the stone and ice formations. He tested the hardness of the ice and looked for signs of how the wind and weather had shaped the landscape over time. David stood in several different locations, turning slowly to feel the wind from different directions. He was mapping the way air moved across the terrain, identifying the areas where the wind was strongest and where it created protected spaces. Professor watched this behavior through her thermal imaging equipment. The human's body temperatures were dropping, just as her research predicted they would. But instead of seeking immediate relief, They seemed to be gathering information about their environment. Fascinating, she said to herself, recording notes on her device. They appear to be conducting some form of environmental assessment, but this behavior is not documented in any of my research on human survival patterns. The alien students had settled into their various survival modes and were now simply enduring the test period. Their strategies were based on conserving energy and waiting for the 6 hours to pass. It was efficient and logical, exactly what millions of years of evolution had designed them to do. The humans, however, continued their systematic exploration of the area. They moved with purpose, but Professor could not understand what they hoped to accomplish. In her thermal readings, she could see their body heat continuing to drop as they expended energy moving around instead of conserving it. After about 30 minutes of this exploration, the three humans came together near a wind-protected depression close to an ice outcropping. They stood in a tight circle, talking quickly and pointing at different features of the landscape around them. Professor increased the sensitivity on her audio equipment, trying to understand what they were discussing. She could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. Wind pattern shifts about every 15 minutes, Sarah was saying. This ice formation is solid enough to cut cleanly, added, holding up a sharp piece of rock he had found. Best location is right here, David said, pointing to the spot where they stood. Protected from the main wind but good drainage for the foundation. Foundation. Professor checked her research notes. Humans were not known to create foundations for temporary shelters. Her data showed that human survival techniques required extensive preparation and pre-made materials. As she watched, the humans began to move with increased urgency and coordination. They had apparently completed their assessment and were ready to begin whatever plan they had developed. Professor leaned forward in her command module, adjusting her cameras to get a better view of what the humans were about to attempt. Her scientific training told her that they were about to demonstrate the limitations she had described in her lecture. But something in the way they moved, the confidence in their actions, made her wonder if she was about to witness something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about human survival capabilities. While the alien students remained locked in their energy-conserving survival modes, the three humans exploded into coordinated action that everything Professor thought she knew about their species' capabilities. Sarah took the lead in directing their efforts, her voice carrying clearly over the wind as she called out instructions. "We need blocks about this size," she said, holding her hands apart to show dimensions. "David, help me mark out the foundation circle. We need it exactly right or the whole thing won't work." Nodded and began examining the ice around them more carefully. He had found several sharp pieces of rock during his earlier exploration, and now he tested them against the ice surface. The larger piece worked well for scoring lines in the ice, while a smaller, sharper fragment could be used for more detailed cutting work. David and Sarah began trampling down the snow in a perfect circle, their feet working in rhythm as they packed the surface firm and level. David used the heel of his boot to mark measurement points around the circle's edge, spacing them evenly by counting his steps. Professor adjusted her instruments to get better readings on what the humans were doing. Her thermal scanners showed that their body temperatures were still dropping, but their activity levels had increased dramatically. According to her research, this should have been accelerating their heat loss to dangerous levels. "Curious," she said into her recording device. "The human subjects appear to be increasing their energy expenditure despite dropping core temperatures. This behavior contradicts established survival protocols for their species." Began the careful work of cutting ice blocks from a flat area near their chosen shelter site. Using the sharp rock as a cutting tool and his metal belt buckle as a scraper, he scored deep lines into the ice surface. The work was precise and methodical, each block cut to nearly identical dimensions. "These are perfect," Sarah said, examining one of the finished blocks. Grandfather always said the secret was making each piece fit exactly with the others. No gaps, no loose spots. David was busy creating what looked like a shallow trench around the outside of their foundation circle. He used his hands and feet to move snow and shape the ground, creating a slight depression that would help their structure sit properly on the surface. The alien students, locked in their various survival states, could observe what was happening but had limited ability to respond or communicate. The students, in their crystalline dormancy, could only watch through their reduced sensory systems. The conserving energy in their connected group state swirled slowly as they tried to process what they were seeing. Only the hive mind students, with their shared consciousness, were able to maintain clear observation and communication. Their antennae moved in rapid, subtle patterns as they shared information about the humans' unexpected behavior. "The humans are constructing something," one of them finally spoke aloud, their insect-like voice carrying a note of surprise. This was not predicted in the professor's research data. Professor heard this comment through her monitoring equipment and felt a flutter of uncertainty in her thorough confidence. Her research had been exhaustive, covering human survival techniques from across their recorded history. But what she was observing now seemed to go beyond anything documented in the academic literature. Had now cut more than a dozen ice blocks, each one roughly the size of a large book but much thicker and heavier. The precision of his work was remarkable considering he was using primitive tools and working in brutal cold. His hands were red with cold, but he continued working with steady determination. Sarah began arranging the first blocks around the edge of their foundation circle, but instead of simply stacking them like a wall, she placed each block at a slight inward angle. The pattern she was creating looked strange to Professor, who had expected to see a simple rectangular shelter if the humans attempted construction at all. "The angle has to be just right," Sarah explained to David as he helped position the blocks. "Each block supports the weight of the one above it, and the whole thing curves inward as it goes up. My grandmother taught me this when I was 12. David nodded, understanding immediately. His own family had passed down similar knowledge about traditional construction techniques. In Korea, my grandfather built similar structures for winter fishing shelters. The dome shape is strongest against wind. As they worked, the humans' movements became more fluid and efficient. What had started as careful, deliberate actions was now becoming almost automatic. Their hands seemed to know exactly how to shape and position each ice block, as if they had been doing this work their entire lives. Professor realized she was witnessing something that her academic training had not prepared her for. The humans were not just using tools or following learned procedures. They were drawing on some kind of deep, inherited knowledge that seemed to emerge naturally under pressure. "Remarkable," she said into her recorder. "The human subjects appear to be accessing instinctive construction techniques that are not documented in their educational background profiles. This suggests the presence of inherited behavioral patterns that have not been previously studied." Continued cutting blocks with increasing speed and accuracy. His movements had developed a rhythm that made the work look almost effortless. The sharp rock moved through the ice in smooth strokes, and each finished block was nearly identical to the others. Sarah and David worked together to position each new block in the growing spiral pattern. Their communication had become almost wordless, with small gestures and brief commands coordinating their efforts perfectly. "This block needs a bit more angle," Sarah would say, and David would immediately adjust his grip to tilt the ice piece exactly as needed. "Next one should be slightly smaller on this side," David would note, and would adjust his cutting technique without even looking up from his work. The structure they were creating was beginning to take a clear shape now. It was a dome made of ice blocks, with each piece fitting precisely against its neighbors. The inward curving spiral pattern was creating a self-supporting arch that required no additional framework or support materials. The alien students watched this construction with growing amazement. Thus, crystalline forms began to vibrate slightly, which was their species' expression of surprise. The slow swirling motions took on patterns that indicated confusion and interest. The hive mind students' antennae moved more rapidly as they processed and shared information about what they were observing. Their collective consciousness was updating its understanding of human capabilities in real time. "Professor," one of the hive mind students called out, their voice carrying clearly across the wind, "our data models for human survival behavior require significant revision. This construction technique is not primitive tool usage. This is sophisticated engineering." Professor looked up from her instruments, her four eyes focusing on the growing ice dome. The humans had completed more than half of the structure, and the engineering principles behind their work were becoming clear to her trained scientific mind. The dome shape provided maximum structural strength with minimum material usage. The inward spiral pattern distributed weight evenly across the foundation. The blocks were cut and placed with precision that would have impressed architects working with advanced tools and materials. And the humans were building it in the middle of a frozen wasteland, using nothing but rocks and their bare hands, while their body temperatures dropped toward dangerous levels. "This is impossible according to my research," Professor said quietly. "Human survival capabilities are clearly documented. They lack the physical adaptations for extended cold weather survival, and their tool usage requires prepared materials and extensive planning time." But the evidence was right in front of her eyes, being constructed block by three graduate students who had never mentioned any specialized training in Arctic survival or ice construction techniques. For the first time in her long academic career, Professor began to wonder if her understanding of human capabilities might be fundamentally incomplete. What happened next would become the subject of academic papers and scientific debates for decades to come. Professor watched in growing astonishment as the three human students moved into their final construction phase with a precision and speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "Okay, we're ready for the final spiral," Sarah announced, her breath creating white clouds in the freezing air. Despite the brutal cold, her voice was steady and confident. "The blocks need to get smaller as we go higher. David, help me with the angles." His hands flew over his work area, cutting smaller blocks with the same careful precision, but at twice the speed. His movements had become completely automatic, muscle memory taking over as ancestral knowledge flowed through his actions. The sharp rock moved through ice like it was butter, each cut clean and exact. Professor activated her chronometer function, recording exact timestamps as she watched. Her scientific training demanded precise documentation, even as her understanding of human capabilities crumbled around her. 8 minutes, 15 seconds since beginning of final construction phase, she spoke into her recorder. "Human subjects are completing structural elements at a rate that exceeds my calculated predictions by a factor of 3. David and Sarah worked in perfect synchronization, each ice block sliding into place as if it had been made specifically for that exact position. Their hands moved together, adjusting angles and fitting pieces with the kind of precision that usually required measuring tools and engineering calculations. The alien students observed this display with emotions their species rarely experienced. These crystalline bodies were now vibrating consistently, creating a soft musical tone that indicated profound amazement. Their dormancy state was being disrupted by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. The gas forms swirled in patterns that had no equivalent in their normal communication systems. They were trying to process information that fell completely outside their understanding of how survival worked. Their species had evolved perfect environmental adaptation, but they had never seen raw adaptation happening in real time. The hive mind students' shared consciousness was buzzing with activity as they tried to incorporate this new data into their collective knowledge base. Individual members of their cluster began emerging slightly from their energy conservation formation, their scientific curiosity overriding their survival instincts. "Professor," one of them called out, their voice carrying a note of urgent confusion. "Our physiological sensors indicate the human's body temperatures have stabilized. This contradicts all models of their species' thermal regulation capabilities." Professor checked her own instruments and confirmed the impossible reading. The humans should have been entering hypothermia by now, but their core temperatures had actually begun to stabilize as their work intensified. The ice dome was now complete except for the very top, shaped the final capstone block with artistic precision, creating a piece that would fit perfectly into the remaining opening. Sarah and David positioned themselves to receive it, their hands ready to guide it into place. 9 minutes 30 seconds, Professor recorded, her voice tight with disbelief. Structural completion appears imminent. The capstone slid into place with a soft sound that somehow carried clearly over the howling wind. The dome was complete, but the humans were not finished. David immediately began cutting a careful opening near the base of the structure, creating an entrance tunnel that angled upward into the dome's interior. "Cold air sinks, warm air rises," he explained briefly to his companions. "The entrance has to be below the main floor level, or we lose all our heat." Sarah was using handfuls of loose snow to fill tiny gaps between blocks, sealing the structure against wind infiltration. Her technique was flawless, each application of snow placed exactly where it would do the most good for insulation. 9 minutes 47 seconds, Professor announced, her voice now carrying a note of awe. "Construction complete." The final timing was impossible to argue with. From the moment they had begun placing the first ice block until David finished cutting the entrance tunnel, exactly 9 minutes and 47 seconds had elapsed. But the truly astonishing thing was what happened next. Professor's thermal imaging equipment immediately began detecting temperature changes inside the completed structure. The dome's interior started warming within seconds of completion, heated only by the presence of the 3 humans inside. The ice blocks they had cut and shaped were acting as perfect insulation, trapping body heat and reflecting it back into the interior space. The dome's curved shape created natural air circulation that distributed warmth evenly throughout the shelter. "Impossible," Professor said quietly, checking and rechecking her instrument readings. "The structure is generating an internal temperature differential of 15 degrees Celsius, using only body heat as an energy source. This level of thermal efficiency requires advanced materials and engineering calculations." Through her audio monitoring equipment, she could hear the humans talking inside their shelter. Their voices were relaxed and comfortable, showing none of the stress or urgency that should have characterized a survival situation. "Remember when Dad took us ice fishing and we built one of these overnight?" was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin ice walls. "My grandfather would have been proud of this one," Sarah replied with obvious satisfaction. "Perfect spiral, good foundation, nice tight seal on all the joints." "Should we tell them how we learned to do this?" David asked with amusement in his voice. "Nah," Sarah said, and Professor could hear laughter in her response. "Let them figure it out." The alien students were now fully emerged from their energy conservation states, their scientific curiosity completely overriding their survival protocols. They had broken their crystalline formation and were slowly moving closer to the ice dome, their bodies chiming softly with each step. They had disconnected their shared atmosphere and were floating individually around the structure, their gas forms swirling in patterns of intense analysis and amazement. The hive mind students had abandoned their clustered survival formation entirely and were examining every aspect of the construction, their antennae moving rapidly as they shared detailed observations and tried to understand the engineering principles involved. "Professor," one of the hive mind students said, their voice carrying profound respect, "we must revise our assessment of human survival capabilities. This construction demonstrates engineering knowledge, inherited behavioral patterns, and adaptive problem-solving abilities that are not documented in any of our species' scientific literature." Professor nodded slowly, her four eyes moving independently as she continued to monitor the thermal readings from inside the ice dome. The interior temperature had now stabilized at a level that would be comfortable for extended habitation. "The humans have created a sustainable microenvironment," she said into her recorder, her scientific training finally reasserting itself. "Using only materials found on site and construction techniques that appear to be instinctive rather than learned, they have solved the survival challenge in under 10 minutes. She paused in her recording, looking around at the alien students who were now completely focused on studying the human construction rather than conserving their own energy for survival. "Furthermore," she continued, "their solution is so effective that it has disrupted the survival protocols of all other species present, as scientific curiosity has the other students' evolutionary survival instincts." From inside the ice dome came the sound of more laughter, and Professor realized that the humans were not just surviving the test conditions, they were thriving in them. For the first time in her distinguished academic career, Professor understood that her research had been fundamentally incomplete. She had studied human limitations without ever considering human potential. The 10-minute miracle was not just about building a shelter. It was about the emergence of capabilities that her species had never imagined could exist. 6 hours later, when the Research Shuttle Academic Explorer returned to collect the students, Professor witnessed a scene that would forever change how the galactic academic community understood human capabilities. The alien students emerged from their various survival states showing clear signs of exhaustion and cold stress. They moved slowly, their crystalline bodies dulled and cloudy from the energy drain of maintaining their dormancy state for extended periods. The gas forms were pale and moved sluggishly, their environmental suits showing frost buildup from the strain of temperature regulation. The hive mind students clustered together more tightly than usual, their shared consciousness working to redistribute the energy costs of their survival effort among the group. Several individuals in their cluster showed signs of significant fatigue, their antennae movements slow and irregular. All of the emergency shelters that Professor had prepared remained untouched, still covered with the same layer of wind-blown snow that had accumulated during the 6-hour test period. Then the entrance to the ice dome moved, and the 3 human students emerged looking refreshed, warm, and completely comfortable. Their faces showed healthy color instead of the pale exhaustion that should have marked a 6-hour survival ordeal. They stretched and moved like people who had just finished a relaxing afternoon instead of a life-threatening test. "That was actually pretty cozy once we got it sealed up properly," Sarah said, brushing snow off her jacket. "We ended up playing word games for the last couple of hours." Nodded and grinned at his companions. "Remember when we tried to teach David that card-counting game your brother showed you? He picked it up way too fast." "Mental math keeps your mind sharp in cold weather," David explained with a laugh. "My grandfather always said that staying mentally active was just as important as staying physically warm." Professor stared at the 3 humans in complete disbelief. According to her instruments, the interior of their ice shelter had maintained a comfortable temperature throughout the entire test period. Her thermal readings showed that the structure had become increasingly efficient over time, actually improving its insulation properties, as the ice walls developed a thin layer of interior glazing from condensation and refreezing. She approached the ice dome with scientific curiosity, her multiple eyes examining the construction from different angles simultaneously. The engineering was remarkable. Each block fit perfectly against its neighbors, the spiral pattern distributed structural loads evenly, and the dome shape provided maximum strength with minimal material usage. "How did you learn to build this?" she asked the human students, her voice carrying genuine amazement instead of her usual academic authority. "My grandmother taught me when I was little," Sarah replied simply. Her family came from northern Canada, where people have been building these for thousands of years. She said it was important to remember the old skills, even if we had modern technology. "My father learned from his grandfather, who emigrated from northern Russia," added. "He taught me during winter camping trips, said you never know when you might need to build shelter from nothing but what you find around you." "In Korea, my family has stories going back generations about winter survival techniques," David explained. "My grandfather was very serious about making sure I understood how our ancestors survived in the mountains during difficult times." Professor felt a fundamental shift occurring in her understanding of human development. These students had not learned specialized survival techniques in academic settings. They carried inherited knowledge that had been passed down through family lines across centuries of human experience. "But the precision of your construction," she said, gesturing at the dome. "The thermal efficiency calculations, the structural engineering principles, these require advanced mathematical understanding." Sarah exchanged a look with her companions before answering. "We didn't calculate anything, Professor. We just built it the way our families taught us. The techniques work because generations of people figured out what worked and what didn't, usually by trial and error in situations where mistakes meant death." This answer sent shockwaves through Professor's scientific worldview. The humans had achieved engineering excellence not through theoretical knowledge, but through inherited practical wisdom that had been refined over countless generations of real-world application. The alien students gathered around the ice dome, studying its construction with new respect. The hive mind students moved their antennae in rapid patterns as they shared this revolutionary information through their collective consciousness. "Professor," one of them said, their voice carrying notes of profound reconsideration, "our species developed survival adaptations through millions of years of biological evolution. But humans appear to develop survival adaptations through cultural evolution that can occur within single generations and be transmitted through social learning." Professor nodded slowly, beginning to understand the implications. Cultural adaptation rather than biological adaptation, knowledge transmission across generations without genetic modification. She activated her recording equipment and began documenting what would become the most important research of her career. "Revised assessment of human survival capabilities," she spoke into the device. "Humans compensate for physical limitations through rapid cultural adaptation, inherited knowledge systems, and collaborative problem-solving abilities that allow them to develop effective survival solutions in real time using only environmental materials." The shuttle pilot approached and informed them it was time to return to the research station. As the students boarded, Professor took one last look at the ice dome the humans had constructed. The structure was still perfectly intact, showing no signs of wear or instability. Her instruments confirmed that it could provide safe shelter for days or even weeks if properly maintained. Built in under 10 minutes using primitive tools and inherited knowledge, it was more effective than the advanced emergency shelters she had prepared. Back aboard the research station Convergence, word of the humans' achievement spread rapidly through the academic community. Professor found herself fielding requests for interviews, data sharing, and collaborative research proposals from colleagues across the galaxy. She spent the following weeks completely revising her research methodology and conclusions. What she had previously classified as primitive tool usage, she now recognized as adaptive engineering. What she had dismissed as inherited behavioral patterns, she now understood as cultural knowledge transmission systems. The human students became local celebrities aboard the research station. Sarah and David found themselves invited to guest lecture in survival studies, cultural anthropology, and engineering courses. Their demonstration had proven that human survival capabilities were not limited by biological constraints, but enhanced by cultural adaptations that could be learned, shared, and improved across generations. Professor published her revised research as The Human Paradox, Cultural Evolution as Survival Adaptation, which became required reading in xenobiology programs throughout the known galaxy. Her work established an entirely new field of study focused on how different species developed non-biological survival strategies. The ice dome remained intact on Ara's surface for several months, serving as a landmark for subsequent research expeditions. It became known among the academic community as the 10-minute miracle, a symbol of how cultural knowledge could achieve results that seemed to defy scientific understanding. Most importantly, Professor formed a permanent research partnership with several human academic institutions. She understood now that her previous research had been incomplete because she had studied human limitations rather than human potential. When the next semester began, Professor found herself teaching a completely different course. Adaptive survival strategies across species included guest lectures from human students and faculty who demonstrated techniques that had been refined through centuries of practical application. The 3 human students continued their graduate studies with new confidence in their species' unique capabilities. They had proven that humans did not survive through biological superiority, but through something far more remarkable: the ability to rapidly adapt, learn, and build solutions from nothing but knowledge, determination, and whatever materials they could find around them. The galaxy had discovered that humanity's greatest strength was not what they had evolved to become, but what they could become when necessity demanded innovation. And that lesson would change how every species in the galactic community understood the relationship between survival, adaptation, and the power of inherited wisdom.